Very well. Now, if you commit suicide, all you're doing is kicking the stone a little further down the road. Except the next time you have to carry the bloody thing, it might be heavier, when it didn't necessarily have to be.
All right, Hermiit. Speak English to me.
There's a part of you that's impossible to kill, even if you kill the exterior.
So you're talking about souls now. Is that what this is, Hermiit?
It's a bit of a misnomer. Same with the word spirit. I don't even like using that word. Too many religious connotations.
Hermiit, I'm a man of science. If it's anything that can be proven with a meter or a chart, it's absolutely pointless.
Oh, okay. Well, let me ask you this. Would you agree that before pathogens were discovered, or before microscopes were even invented, that had someone come up with the kooky idea that washing your hands could keep you healthy from dangerous invisible things, that it nevertheless would have been a very good idea to do so, especially back then?
Yes, Hermiit, I suppose I'd have to agree with that.
All right then. Listen, it's good to be skeptical as long as you have a counter theory. But if all you can say is, nope, impossible, only because it isn't officially discovered yet, due to a current lack of the necessary instrumentation perhaps, or because it's not popular, then you're treating science as a faith. Many so-called skeptics only stand on the shoulders of scientists who've actually done the work, so they have an excuse to shout from their own pulpits.
Yet you're asking me to believe in what you're saying now.
No, I'm not asking you to believe in anything. I don't believe these things, and I've never claimed to know them either. All I do is integrate them into my own perspective as strong possibilities, because they appear logical to me given my own experiences, many of which would be disregarded by established science as either delusion or lies, despite having also coincidentally been experienced by thousands of other people separated by thousands of miles over thousands of years. So there are certain things that I treat as a truth because it would appear wise to do so. Okay, well, look at it this way. What good is a man of science if he's dead in the ground? Because he felt like offing himself. Tell me, how clever are you when you're a corpse?
All right, Hermiit. You spoke of logic. Tell me, what is the logic behind the concept of me having a spirit?
I'll only use the word spirit for now for the sake of simplicity, even though it would probably be better understood as something like essence energy or excitation impulse, creational energy, something like that.
Creational energy. As in creationism?
No, no. No deities, no messiahs, no worship, no guardian angels, no afterlife tribunals, none of that. All I'm talking about here is the storage, the transfer, and the transfiguration of the finest energetical impulses, purely as a function of evolution, which is how anything can even exist.
Okay.
Alright, this is when you start to require a little bit more imagination. I'm going to present this to you as a story, as it was passed down to me, and then you can...
Passed down from...
I'll get to that later. But for now, just consider whether or not the concepts or principles I described seem plausible to you, alright?
All right.
Nothingness. No particles, no energy. Nothing. Just an endless void. A true void. Somehow, the first faint impulses ever in existence form out of a self-excited state, and when the positive and negative forms of those impulses attract, they create new impulses. These impulses form over and over again until finally, this mass of impulses can't stand its own pressure, which results in the first ever Big Bang. Now you have this gigantic space, like a sphere, where this timeless or spiritual energy can exist in relative stasis, where things are less volatile, until eventually the impulses in the center of the sphere become even denser and denser, which results in another Big Bang. This process continues several more times until finally, you have all of these concentric spheres of increasing densities of these impulses. Almost like those Russian nesting dolls.
Yes, I know those.
Matryoshka dolls, I think they're called. Anyway, that last doll, that baby doll inside the rest, is finally dense enough and capable enough to sustain actual universes, countless universes, through their own little Big Bangs, one of which we obviously live in. However, as opposed to those previous larger concentric spheres of energy that exist in relative stasis, all these little universes are not static at all. They're like their own evolving entities, more or less, expanding and contracting endlessly. So it's like these spheres more so represent the substrate, or soil, and it's only after a number of generations that it becomes rich enough or dense enough to finally be able to support that living, growing seed.
Okay.
Now, if you zoomed out over all these universes, you could think of them as butted up against each other like soap bubbles, or better yet, like cells. And like cells, each universe has its own version of a nucleus, or that area in which the Big Bang occurred. That's the informational center, or the foundation for all other processes that take place in the universe. After that nucleus, you then have several more transitional zones, again, of varying densities of energetical impulses, until finally, through the colliding of positive energy from one of the inner zones with the negative energy coming from the outer zones, the conditions are created in which dense matter can exist. First the gases, then eventually liquids and solids. After countless eons, you now have this thin, concentric sphere of nebula, galaxies, stars, planets, etc., tucked deep inside the universe, complete with a kind of cell wall. So it can exist adjacent to other universes surrounding it.
What's in that pipe, Hermiit?
It's not relevant.
I think it's pretty relevant.
It's not what's in the pipe.
All right. Here's a relevant question. Why in the exact hell did you tell me all of that?
Well,
And more importantly, what does that have anything to do with me having a spiritual essence?
I was just about to get to that.
Please do.
Spiritual information can exist in different agglomerations, like how a water molecule can exist in different material states. Some forms of spiritual impulses live in relative stasis. For instance, like those original concentric spheres.
The Russian dolls.
Exactly. While other spiritual impulses evolve or build up in a much more acute, complex fashion. And the same can be said if you look at it from a microcosmic level, specifically on planets that can support life. So on one hand, you have spiritual information that, in its densest form, exists more or less in stasis, like rocks for instance. While on the other hand, you have spiritual information that evolves more acutely, in the form of biological life.
Got it.
Okay, but here's the thing. Basic spiritual information can manifest anywhere in the physical universe. And apparently, when the conditions are right on certain primordial planets to facilitate the combination of specific amino acid structures, primordial ooze basically, the resulting cellular structures tend to attract a specific agglomeration of that spiritual information, and bingo, you've got an animated, autonomous, evolving entity. Not to be confused with the genetic evolution of a species, which, though very much integrated into the process of an evolving entity, represents a different process. Basically, spiritual and genetic evolution work in tandem, you could say.
Wait a minute. The only way a species can evolve is if there are new specimens to pass on genetic information to new generations.
Yeah?
So how the hell can a singular entity evolve if it dies?
And now we've arrived at the original point that I wanted to make. No entity exists for the sake of its species. It exists for the sake of itself. Its singular existence necessitates its singular evolution. That's why the quantum essence of an entity never technically dies. Only the physical aspect of it does. Remember, spiritual information is timeless. Physical information, however, is certainly not. It needs to be shed with every generation. And it's that fleshy, pulpy material that's not only malleable enough to grow, but transient enough to allow that evolution to take place. Death is necessary for growth. That's why that type of spirit aggregate, that animating impulse, isn't going to do any good attaching itself to a rock. It can't anyway. Because it needs a cell structure that can act as a semi-closed system for it to be able to function within. And that's why the spirit ends up basically serving as the battery power for that organism. Because you could have lightning strike primordial ooze all day. It doesn't mean that it's going to become alive. You need a consistent situated pulse for certain other functions to take place. Genetic information can't store a real-time pulse to jumpstart a new entity. The genes are more or less responsible for the film reel. The pulse is what turns on the projector.
But how does a spiritual pulse even attach to random cellular material to begin with?
Every attraction in the universe is based on a relationship between positive and negative. Each has something the other one wants. Spiritual information apparently just wants to keep aggregating. So, much like how a certain richness of that spiritual soil was necessary for universes to start growing in, that biochemical material is apparently rich enough to sustain that particular spirit aggregate so that it can evolve. So, while serving as the entity's battery, it also ends up facilitating the hard drive that collects the information accrued during the life of that organism. Then once that organism dies, that information becomes processed and reformed to be used again in the next life, presumably in a more efficient way.
Next life. So you're talking about reincarnation.
Another stigmatized term, but yeah, that's about right.
So what, if I'm a jerk, I come back as a toad or something, right?
No. That's what I mean about the stigmatization of the word. Yes, unfortunately, many dogmatic elements have been added onto the concept of reincarnation that have given it a bad name. So, it's very important not to conflate an ancient neutral concept with all the religiosities that it's attracted over time. In and of itself, the concept of the necessity of cycles isn't strange at all compared to anything else that can be observed in nature. Night and day, seasonal cycles, ice age cycles, galaxy cycles. But back to the thing about coming back as a toad if you're naughty. Karma is horseshit. Kids born with disabilities must have done something terrible in a previous life. I've heard that one before. The millions of Africans shipped across the world as slaves. The millions of Jews killed in the Holocaust. What, they just had it coming? Because they were all naughty enough in their previous lives to deserve that? That would mean that Hitler is the agent and facilitator of karmic balance for millions of people. A woman getting assaulted in an alley at night. Hey, it's just her karma being balanced out. Nobody deserves those things. Karma was invented by people who either didn't want to face the burden of empathy or the guilt of wishing ill on others, since something else would be doing the punishing for them. It's also much easier to force meaning onto chaos rather than to face it for what it really is. It's similar with the idea of guardian angels, actually, which a lot of people think are responsible for certain good fortunes, which would mean that those who didn't receive similar fortunes just didn't deserve them, or their guardian angels just fell asleep on the job. Oh well, fuck those people, I guess. Childish nonsense. Now, if someone inadvertently sabotages themselves through their own actions, out of repressed guilt, let's say, or if someone retaliates against them for something they did, that's not karma. That's just cause and effect. What makes someone deserving or undeserving is a purely human construct, not a natural one.
I agree with that.
I figured, but the frog thing, it's bad enough thinking that a person could be punished for something that an entirely different version of that person did in the past, with an entirely different memory and identity. Let alone thinking that turning into a frog is going to set things right. Because all a frog wants to do is eat and make more froggies. At no point will a frog ever go, hey, maybe I'm a frog because I was a really bad human in a previous life. I should really mend my ways. If any person is going to mend their ways, then it has to be done consciously, during whatever current life that person is living. And consciousness is the key word there. Plants and trees have a very subtle, impulse-based consciousness, sure. Fish, amphibians, etc. have what you would call an instinct consciousness. Certain animals, though, apes, dolphins, elephants, wolves, ravens, etc., have a form of intelligent social consciousness. But hominids, in our case Homo sapiens, are able to develop a reflexive consciousness. In other words, we're conscious of the fact that we're conscious. We think about the fact that we can think. We have that voice in our head that tries to understand the past and the future, good and bad, meaning, meaninglessness, how the universe works, etc. That's a lot of hard drive space. Try fitting that into a worm's brain. Not gonna happen. So basically, if that specific spiritual agglomerate attaches to an organism for the first time, it's because that's the genetic material that it corresponds with, or is most attracted to, based on a level of consciousness it's able to facilitate. And that's the genetic line it tends to follow from that point on. Until, I suppose, there's some significant enough mutation in the genes.
I do have one question, though, Hermiit.
Ask away.
You said something before about kicking the burdensome stone further down the road if I decided to end my life.
Yes?
Now, that sounds to me like I'm punishing myself in a subsequent life. Yet you say that can't happen.
I'm glad you brought that up. Your mental state prior to suicide might play a role in your subsequent life. Not because it's at all a matter of punishment, but again, simply a matter of cause and effect. Your spirit is a manifestation of a purely logical process. So that's why it's naturally attracted to the information or essences of thoughts that are pure and logical. What's typically defined as goodness is logical because it usually has a beneficial effect on the surrounding environment, which then circles back to you in the end. The spirit essentially aims to exist in relative perfection until finally reaching the level of perfection of that source from which it came, or that spiritual core at the center of the universe.
What do you mean it looks for purity? Keep making it sound like a conscious act.
No, not in the sense of a physical, material consciousness like we're using to speak to each other now. That obviously requires a physical neural network. Spiritual consciousness has nothing to do with an ego or gender identity or anything like that. Those are things that we deal with because they're obviously necessary in a physical life. But if you want to learn to pay closer attention to the impulses your spirit puts out, as cliche as it sounds, you need to learn to meditate more.
I'm not gonna sit on the ground for hours chanting Nepalese, Hermiit.
No, and that's what I mean about the stigmatization of terms again. All I meant was learning to turn off your conscious thoughts as much as you can for as long as you can at given points. And you can do that anywhere technically, but preferably when you don't have too many distractions and preferably during the same time of day. The spirit is just putting out faint impulses that you can unconsciously assimilate in the form of peace and neutrality. The spirit itself is not inherently anthropological, but the block of information that it facilitates from the once living being is obviously going to correspond to that being's particular complexity. So as a human, as a consciousness, you have the capacity, for instance, to be extremely aware of your final moments and the fact that they are your final moments. That heightened awareness can be so acute and so intense that it's able to overshadow the intensity of most other life experiences. However, those memories of all your other life experiences and of all your other deeds are still very much present, even if, up until this point at least, they've been very well hidden. And like any other time that you push certain things you've done back into your subconscious that you don't want to have to confront, here they all come now, because as you're dying, all those mental barriers are breaking down. So if you were a good person in life, you'll probably feel fine. But if you were a really bad person, you're going to feel it. And all condensed within that final split second. And that's the closest thing to hell that anyone is able to create for themselves.
Shit.
Yeah, which is why it's always a good idea to confront your faults as they happen. Or at least sometime before you die. So if you've, for instance, killed people for any other reason besides self-defense, hatred, vengeance, joy even, you're going to need some alone time for a long time to understand why that was wrong. And if you kill yourself, well, that's obviously the complete opposite of killing out of self-defense. It's the most contrary act to evolutional logic that one can possibly commit, which you can't rectify afterwards by intellectually or emotionally confronting because, well, you're dead. So, all you end up doing is making yourself even more emotionally stunted next time around, which makes it even harder to live that life. Nothing to do with some wispy karmic force putting you on its naughty list to punish you later. But does that next version of you deserve that? Of course not. So don't do it.
So you're saying I should bite the bullet and not put the bullet in the brain?
Yeah. And besides, I kind of like you despite how much of a jerk you can be. But to that last point, after death, that information from the former consciousness, which the spirit is still connected to, will still be worked out and resolved as much as it possibly can be before it's ready to constitute a new personality. Like how your dreams work out all the stimuli you took in during the previous day. And all the while your spirit's still extracting only the purest essences of that information. Love, wisdom, etc.
Why would a quantum impulse care about love and wisdom, Hermiit?
It doesn't care about those things. It's attracted to them. Because they represent the closest approximation to its vibrational level. Wisdom, love, peace, freedom, those are all essentially the highest conscious expressions of growth, stability, and the realization of connectedness. And since spiritual impulses want to keep connecting and growing in a consistent form, those are the conscious expressions that are most logical and beneficial to draw from. Not because they're just fluffy, pretty words.
You know, Hermiit, none of this really sits well with me. I know you're trying to sound as scientific about it as possible, but it's still all got that new age veneer of astrology and crystals, psychics, mediums, ghost hunting, all that nonsense.
All right, I get it. But let me at least make a point about those things you just mentioned. Ghost hunting. Supposedly, you're constantly putting out frequencies that correlate to your thought patterns. EEG machines can display a number of those frequencies, but not all of them. And those finer frequencies apparently have no problem penetrating through skull, and also no problem settling on various objects. Now, if you have a very old house with a lot of past human activity and human trauma, and years later you have a person who's particularly sensitive to those impulses who goes and visits a place like that, yeah, they might sense something. And maybe their brain will even translate that information into images and words. But here's where it gets interesting. If it actually comes down to the point where you're hearing banging sounds or seeing shadows, it means that the human responsible for those old impulses causing activity is either still alive and just living somewhere else, or it means that the spirit associated with those impulses and that person has already reincarnated into a new person. Basically, the impulses that have settled in an old place can only be reactivated if the spirit associated with them is currently in the same physical plane. It's like they require that phantom power to turn on. But the shadows and banging aren't actually dead, invisible people. If someone's actually dead, the spirit's continuing to evolve in its own timeless plane. Now, if you're actually seeing a clear yet semi-transparent form of a person somewhere, then it probably means the person with the associated spirit is very close to their old bones, in order to be able to unconsciously trigger that manifestation. It's like the signal gets stronger with the increasing proximity of the source. Because bones store a lot of impulses from the former personality. That's perhaps why apparitions were more commonly written about in the past. Most people back then were buried in family plots and churchyards. So if you have people living and dying in the same area for generations, as was common, then there was a possibility for the chance that people were incidentally incarnated somewhere close to their old bones. These days, people are moving everywhere, dying everywhere. In some cases, the bones are even cremated, so fewer apparitions now, at least in modernized areas. Interesting stuff. I suppose in some very rare circumstances, an apparition could be just a dream projection too, but the rabbit hole's already getting kinda...
Yeah.
Now, if it's the case of a so-called haunting, where things are actually getting thrown around, that's psychotelekinesis. Basically what a poltergeist is. It's caused by someone present in the situation with a highly traumatized subconscious and who is unaware that the impulses they are putting out, those highly volatile electromagnetic oscillations, are what's actually causing the apparent activity. If you were able to move things with your mind willfully, then that would just be called telekinesis. But if there's anyone on Earth who's evolved to Jedi-like status, I've certainly never witnessed it. Maybe a couple of them are still roaming around somewhere, but for the vast majority of humans, the subconscious is the only part of you that has enough power to have an effect like that.
So mediums, then. They don't necessarily do all their readings in haunted houses, so how would they even pick up on those impulses?
Ah, well, for the mediums that aren't bullshitting you, those impulses probably come from the Earth's copy of those impulses from that former personality. So your spirit is attached to that information, but a sort of copy of that information also becomes naturally stored on the respective planet itself, along with the thoughts of all humans, or the echoes of those thoughts, you could say. Tape recorders might even pick up on that stuff sometimes.
All right, Hermiit. It just sounds like you're making up arbitrary rules now.
Hey, I told you already, I know that there's no way I can prove any of this.
But you sound very sure about it as you're telling me.
Because if I began every sentence with apparently, allegedly, supposedly, theoretically, it would take twice as long to tell you all of this. Would you like that?
No.
Then, may I finish?
You may absolutely finish, Hermiit.
I'm almost done, you bastard.
All right, then.
The thing about that last point, though, you're not going to gain any insights from tapping into that stored information that you couldn't already gain from living your own life. And if you're messing around with that stuff more or less to get a kick out of it, then just remember, not everyone is completely good, so the stuff they leave behind isn't necessarily going to be good either. Now, some people who claim to be psychic may, in some cases, be able to predict certain things about the future. But technically, anyone has the ability to do this to some level.
Bullshit.
Listen, if you have a line of standing dominoes, and you knock over the first one, you can more or less know or predict that the last one will be knocked over at some point. But because your subconscious is like a supercomputer, it's able to see that last domino falling way farther than you can. It's able to see that resulting event from that very long chain of cause and effect. And because your subconscious is connected to your dreams, it's in your dreams where you'd be most likely to see those visions, if at all. But it's still very rare. Crystals. I suppose because of their structure, they may be able to store impulses a little better. So if they're imbued with positive thought impulses, for instance, then there can be a kind of positive feedback loop if you meditate with them a lot. But for that to have any real considerable effect, you'd probably need some very advanced technological aid. I mean, I like crystals, they're pretty, but objects themselves don't raise your evolution or anything. You've got to do all that work yourself. Astrology. Now, it may be possible that some of the planets in our solar system have enough radiational influence to affect the development of certain personality traits at birth, while our brains are still partially exposed to the environment. However, if anyone tries to tell you That your secret crush is going to call you next Tuesday because Uranus is over there instead of over there. They're trying to sell you something. Or just trying to sell their own ego to themselves. A lot of it's based on highly romanticized medieval math, because complexity can easily create the illusion of legitimacy. You can make up a game with very complex rules. It doesn't mean it represents reality, it just means you've made a fun game. So a lot of it basically has to do with making life more interesting, or feeling like you have more control over the chaos in the world by pretending you can foretell it. The important thing, though, is to use your own will to create as much of your destiny as you can, rather than wanting fate to decide it for you. Besides, we haven't developed the type of technological tools that can actually determine the sources and correlations of those cosmic frequencies, so I personally can't tell you anything more than that.
Well, you haven't told me about Bigfoot yet.
Oh, well, actually...
No.
They're just leftover Gigantopithecus.
Stop!
They're very smart, but very shy.
Enough! Hermiit, we've had discussions before about the absurdity of deity worship.
Yes?
This stuff is just as bad.
No, listen.
Yes, it is.
No, listen. This stuff is essentially an attempt to find meaning and identity through the interpretation of certain natural relationships, even if elements of it are highly presumptuous or incomplete. Deity worship denies nature by placing meaning in whether or not a giant invisible man in the sky finds favor with you for worshiping him properly. So if somebody worships another deity or just worships the same one improperly, there might be a little violence. Amethyst heals the heart chakra. No, it heals the crotch chakra. There's never going to be a war over that crap.
Okay, maybe they're a little different.
Right. I do love too, by the way, how the people most obsessed with God are the people who love to conflate sex with gender, yet are entirely comfortable referring to an apparently sexless deity as him and he.
Well, it's like you said. He's a big invisible man, so he's got a penis. It's just invisible, that's all.
Oh yeah, guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, as I was saying before, at least when you're trying to make sense of nature, however zigzaggy that path may be, there's still a possibility that you can discover something that will lead to an advancement of some kind.
Sure, but there's still this Pollyanna quality to the whole reincarnation thing. It's okay, you all get second chances.
It's not about something sounding pleasant. It's about it being logical and ultimately beneficial. Take the heaven and hell thing. We obviously don't have to go into why it's illogical, but it's also just not beneficial to assume that every human being you see is destined to either one of those eternities, because what it really suggests is that people deserve to be judged as either entirely good or entirely bad. At least if you see everyone and everything as being part of the same growing, evolving process as you are, then you'll be more likely to treat all entities with respect. That would be a much better culture to be born into.
Or, a better culture could be just one without gods, spirits, and reincarnation, where people actually appreciate each other for being beautiful, fragile, temporary beings.
Sure, a lot of people can do that. They can see themselves as just purely chemical reactions and still be very kind, contented people. But not everybody. Most people seem to at least have some intuition that things are more complicated than they immediately appear. The only real danger, though, is when people like that get sucked into the wrong narrative. Basically, the problem is when people are so open-minded that their own brains begin to fall out too.
And you, of course, think you have that perfect balance between open-mindedness and brain retainment.
Listen, when you're dealing with fringe sciences, everyone's got their own very specific amalgam of reality. And a lot of the time, anyone else who merely suggests something outside of that reality is unevolved to the other fringe people. You also have a lot of people who just flat out think it's pretentious and egotistical to want to try to figure out those types of things, either because it's currently impossible to know or because no one truly deserves to know them. And those are typically the people who prefer the safety of vagary, Otherwise, you take away the magic of something by trying to understand it. Then you have people who talk about being spiritual, which is a redundancy because technically everything is spiritual. Which makes it even funnier when someone claims that they're more spiritual than someone else, when if anything, what those people are really referring to is the fact that they perhaps just think about that stuff more, or that they're more calm because they meditate more often. Which are purely conditions of the consciousness, not the spirit. But you can't tell them that, can you? It's funny too, because some of these people claim to be non-religious, yet fail to realize when they react to disagreement by being insecure and defensive, that it means that their spirituality is very much functioning as a religion, rather than as a healthy framework of consideration. I mean, why do you think I'm a hermit? I am tired of trying to decipher or predict what other people are going to think of me based on what I say. Usually starts when someone's confronted with an idea or aspect of themselves that they don't want to confront, that they then project onto someone else in order to lessen their own shame. That's of course when they start forming their little alliances, using more lies of course, and by the end of it, you've pretty much got a mini religion going on behind your back. Just pride and fickleness. I'm beyond it. I'm better than that.
Well, you have to do what's right for you, Hermiit. For me, though, it just makes more sense that the universe will expand out into nothingness. When things die, the bodies and thoughts do the same. Good old entropy.
Entropy.
Mm-hmm.
Yet things still had to begin. That's the natural, observable precedent for them being able to begin again. You throw a ball up in the air with a given force, it has to come back down. It doesn't just go out forever or disappear.
No, you just reincarnate forever then. Hmm?
No, I did not say that actually.
Oh boy.
It takes many, many millions of years before a human, or any reflexively conscious creature, is so consciously evolved that his or her material frequency rate changes to the point where they might even slowly become invisible to people like you or me, whose material is still at a comparably lower frequency. But even in that state, those highly evolved humans still go through evolution cycles that last even more millions of years, until eventually merging with the frequency of the central core of the universe, the spiritual core, and all universes do the same. As they go through their expansion and contraction cycles, the material sphere slowly becomes immaterial. And again, after many eons, each universe evolves to a frequency rate that not only matches but surpasses that of the outer sphere, until again, after many eons, it then matches the frequency of the next sphere, allowing it to surpass that one as well, which it does through all these spheres until finally reaching the original one when it comes back home, so to speak. This is an endless process. Now, it takes something like 10 to the Googleplex power years for a universe to go through that entire journey. So I don't expect you to be able to conceptualize something like that. In fact, I don't expect you to memorize any of this. It's minutia. The point is, I've done my best to share a story with you to serve as an example of how you can fit into the greater scheme of things, as essentially a small piece of the universe learning about itself in its own particular way, just as every other person or creature does in their own particular way. Yet, everything is connected by the same timeless filament which is connected to that spiritual core of the universe. And that core is pretty much the phantom power that keeps your spirit running. If that universal core just faded out right now, then technically so would you and every other living thing, since you're connected to it. But it won't fade out. So learn to respect at least that part of yourself. You now have a basic framework for the novel that is your existence. So theoretically, it should be a little easier filling the pages in between. And you don't need stars or saints or karma to do it either. all you need is your knowledge and your will. Could I be dead wrong about all of it? Sure. But one thing I do know is that I could never go back to the way that I thought before.
I don't know, Hermiit. There's something strangely comforting about death being final. The simplicity of it. Non-attachment to improvable things. It's an emptiness that feels more sober, dignified than false fulfillment.
Ah, and before you were complaining about feeling empty, weren't you? It's a very Victorian notion, and incidentally, a very adolescent one. If it makes me sad, it's probably true. It's also natural for someone who grows up in a religious setting full of false promises to then mentally escape that world only to sneer at any other idea that's remotely hypothetical. It's an equal and opposite reaction, though unfortunately also equal in its extremity. And I also understand the comfort of simplicity. The simplicity of using only your eyes to contemplate a corpse. The simplicity of no longer having to integrate into a failure of a society or the failure of a self, and to simply integrate with nature as soil and perhaps a daisy or two. It's true and it's untrue. The conglomerate of who you are, that specific set of traits and memories, will never exist again as it is, and within a place and time that will also never exist again as they are. And that certainly makes you special, and this place and time special. But the strife of existence apparently beats the simplicity of non-existence. Otherwise, nothing would exist. You will get your rest, though, sooner or later. So you might as well stick around for the show until it happens. Unfortunately, though, because of overpopulation, everyone's resting time is getting shortened and more strained.
Because of the increasing amount of bodies to have to animate.
Right. So, as time goes on, more and more people wake up like people who haven't gotten a full night's rest. They're more groggy, indifferent, their identities get mismatched. You've got so many more bodies now that they need entirely new spirits, which might also explain the rising ignorance. Aside from not getting enough sleep, though, cremation is actually another thing that can cause confusion in a subsequent life. As I've said, your bones store a ton of impulses from your former personality, which they can't store once they get burnt to ash. But in a subsequent life, those impulses can aid in some unconscious gaps in your identity, because that former link in the chain is still technically there to pull extraneous information from.
Well, how the hell do you even know where your former bones are?
You don't need to know that. They just need to be somewhere on Earth while you're living on it. The organs aren't really necessary, though, even though they store some of those impulses too, which is why some organ transplants apparently result in random personality changes in the recipients. But all the chemicals they stuff in bodies and in suits and expensive coffins and all that, terrible for the ecosystem. All you need is a simple cloth and a pine box. You're all set. And there are also those thoughts from your previous lives that surround the planet. So you can unconsciously pick up on those to aid in certain subtle recognitions based on whatever your current circumstances in life. But the main thing to remember out of all of this is that nothing stays in one state forever. So even death has to die.